So we're finally back to lecture. I'm so sorry about missing class earlier this week. I ended up pulling 2 all-nighters this week to make some deadlines, and when I had your lecture prepared for Wednesday, I was like, this is not finished enough that it wouldn't be a waste of time for them, so I just decided to cancel class instead. I'm guessing that you all liked the extra time to get ready for midterms anyways. So yeah, awesome, thanks. So today we're going to cover estuarine productivity, which was our topic for Wednesday, and we're going to skip invasive species for now. I'll try and link them in a little bit in other lectures, but I don't think they need their whole lecture. So today is estuarine productivity. We're going to cover production, nutrients, organic matter, the outwelling hypothesis, and bird migration today. Lots of great bird video for today's lecture. So the learning goals for today are to understand that for an estuary to support so much life, it has to have a massive supply of organic matter at the base of the food web. And we'll learn about where that organic matter comes from. We'll learn that nutrients are important because they are major components of amino acids. And that means, or they're necessary for primary producers in terms of building their components, or they are a source of energy for bacteria. So that's why nutrients are nutrients. There are many elements in seawater that are found at very low concentrations, and these are trace elements, but they can be immensely important to productivity. And then we'll learn that migratory shorebirds rely on productive estuaries to refuel during their annual migration. All right, so to start off, what is production? So what's meant when I say production? Production might mean something different in some of your fields, but here we're talking about biological production. And by that I mean biomass accumulated by organisms per unit time. And biomass is just any sort of mass, like tissue mass, that's incorporated into an organism. So you can just read it as mass accumulated by organisms per unit time. Primary production is a portion of this, and it's the creation of new organic matter by plants and other autotrophs. So this should be review from Intro to Oceanography. And estuaries are actually among the top in terms of the highest rates of primary production of all of the different types of biomes and ecosystems. And then that that primary production is going to be used as food for other organisms, and we consider that secondary production, which is production by animals. If the animals are eating those plants, they're producing mass over time, and that is secondary production. Ecological efficiency is a concept that you're probably quite familiar with, and it describes the efficiency with which energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. And this is important because it takes a lot of mass to create 1 gram of animal tissue, a lot of energy to create 1 gram of animal tissue. Only about 10% of the transferred energy is stored as tissue. And so organisms have to eat a whole lot of plants to be able to put on mass. And that means for an estuary to support so much life, so many organisms, it has to have a massive supply of organic matter to feed those organisms. And so all of this comes from its immense amounts of primary production, and also from a lot of different organic material that is transported into these estuarine environments through the rivers. And that leads us to our first video. So go ahead and watch that first video. I will link it again for you so you don't even have to scroll up. And you have 3 questions to answer for this video. And I will see you all in a little over 12 minutes. All right, so in that video, you learned about a watershed that's pretty close to home, and where the material that fuels ecosystem production comes from. Not just generated in the marsh itself, but it also comes down through the river as organic material and nutrients. And when I talk about nutrients, I mean materials other than carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that are needed to make organic matter, materials that are needed for life. And I gotta click through these. I didn't know these were on. Oops. There we go. Okay, so these nutrients can come from the red box sources. So they can come from the land as river runoff. That would be the example that you heard about in the video. It can come as nutrients from upwelling of water from the deep. And they can come from the atmosphere, such as from gases and from dust. And the way that these materials are removed from the system are in nutrients from dead organisms and poop that sink to the bottom and settle there. Within the system, nutrients can be processed and kind of recycled by nutrients, which take up the nutrients and then release them when they die for other organisms to use up, and then also nutrients that can be used by organisms themselves. Major nutrients that are important for the coastal areas are nitrogen, which is so vital because it's a major component of chlorophyll. So it's very, very important for marsh plants. Not only nitrogen, but also phosphorus are super important because they are components of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. So these are needed to build tissue. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the most important, but we have a couple others that are super important at coastal areas and in the ocean in general, and that is silicon, which is a major nutrient for some phytoplankton. They make their shells out of it, so they need it to be able to do primary production and grow. This is commonly found in nature as quartz, and it's transported to the ocean in rivers and groundwater. And so there's usually a lot of silicon in coastal areas, not so much in the open ocean. So there might be some competition for that resource in the open ocean. And then sulfate is necessary as an oxidizer for sulfate, or a reducing agent for sulfate reducing bacteria. And this is a major component of saltwater, but it's not found in very high amounts in freshwater. So in an estuary, when you get into the fresher reaches, you might find areas where there's not really enough sulfate to drive this bacterial production in the sediments. So nitrogen, phosphorus, silicon, and sulfate would be some of the major nutrients in coastal systems and in the ocean. Nutrients are part of the process that makes coastal systems so productive. There's so many nutrients in coastal systems, but there's also a lot of organic matter that serves as food for organisms that live there. When a tree falls in a stream, there's always something to make use of it, and eventually the end products of those organisms that are making use of that tree will make their way into coastal areas. Organic matter is important because it's the source of carbon, which is the building block of living tissue. When a leaf or some sort of plant matter sticks, whole tree, when they fall into the stream, they form what we call coarse particulate organic matter. Anything large, anything that's like super easy to see with your eye, that would be coarse particulate organic matter. And then organisms will process this. They'll break it down, they'll shred it up, and as they do, it gets into smaller and smaller pieces, and we consider this fine particulate organic matter. Still visible with the eye, but it's going to form more of a sediment-like material. When organic matter is broken down into microscopic bits where you can't see it anymore, it's in the water, it's moving with the water, that's when it's called dissolved organic matter. So these are just different size classes of organic matter. But the size fraction that's transported into coastal areas that's used most often and most important is the fine particulate organic matter. That's what coastal organisms are using for food. In addition to the major nutrients, there are also many elements that are not found very often. They're actually found in very low concentrations, but they're immensely important to productivity. And the major example in the world's oceans is iron, which makes up only 1/1000th of the dissolved mass in seawater. but it's an essential nutrient required for all life in the ocean. This is usually the nutrient that limits life in the open ocean. When iron is missing, you can't really have things grow. It's, in that case, if it's limiting the production of organisms, then we would consider it the limiting nutrient. And that's whichever nutrient is in least supply relative to the demand. So even a really, really abundant nutrient can be a limiting nutrient. Like nitrogen can be a limiting nutrient if the demand is really high and there's just not a lot of nitrogen around. But when your demand is when your supply is already really low, like with iron, that means if there's anything that is using up that iron and there's no supply, then oftentimes these trace nutrients can be their limiting nutrients. Iron comes from rivers, from dust blowing off of deserts, and from hydrothermal vents. And so there is a lot of iron in coastal areas, which again lends to their productivity. Not so much iron in the open ocean. This is some advanced material. The outwelling hypothesis is a it's not like a natural law or anything like that, but this is how we think that these systems work. So we think that there's a process by which estuaries can supply extra organic material and nutrients to support the productivity of other ecosystems offshore. So the idea is that if you have a really healthy marsh, that marsh will be outwelling food offshore to support really healthy fisheries. People have studied this hypothesis extensively over time because it's really important in quantifying the value of marsh to fish production. And what they found is that outwelling does occur in some cases. It's really dependent upon the productivity of the marsh, how much tidal flushing you get, so the tidal amplitude. You have to have something to carry that material out into the coastal ocean. It depends on the geology, and also the frequency of major precipitation events, which can also flush some of that material out into offshore waters. And they found that outwelling does not occur in every estuary, so it's estuary dependent. It tends to occur more in estuaries with extensive coastal marshes, like those found in Louisiana. So where you get these vast expanses of marsh, like in coastal Louisiana, you tend to get some sort of outwelling where the productivity from that marsh is fueling the productivity of coastal fisheries. All right, so we're going to do our quiz. Go ahead and put away your notes. This question is, which of the following are true about trace nutrients? More than one answer may be correct. Choose all the correct answers. Okay, so the correct answers were A, C, and D. They're found at very low concentrations. One example of a trace nutrient is iron, and they may be a limiting nutrient. B was incorrect, so they can be just as important as abundant nutrients like nitrogen. Nice job. All right, so now we have our second video, which relates to bird migration in the Yellow Sea. This one I have you starting partway through the video. You're welcome to watch the beginning of the video later. It's really interesting. It has lots of little baby bird videos, but the most important part starts at that link. And there is 1 or 2 questions associated with this. I'll see you guys in 7.5 minutes. So in that video, you learned about the Yellow Sea and how it's a really important stopover on major bird migration route. And some of the aspects that make these massive estuarine systems so important to bird migrations that really kind of prevent a bird from using just any system to feed itself when it's on these migrations. One being the massive productivity of these systems, another one being the amount of resources for which these birds are specifically specialized to consume. So these places are extremely important to bird migrations, and this productivity helps to fuel these migrations. I also have 2 more videos to end class on the relationship between the horseshoe crab and the red knot. The first video that you're going to watch, I don't have any questions for that. It's just kind of interesting to learn about how we use horseshoe crabs. So I'm going to link that here. And then the second video, there is, I think, 1 question for that one. And that one explains the relationship between horseshoe crabs and red knots. So I will check back in with you at the end of class after you get a chance to watch these. Alright, so that's the end of class today. Just to rehash the learning goals for today, you learned that for an estuary to support so much life, it must have a massive supply of organic matter at the base of the food web, which estuaries do, both from that estuary itself and from the water coming in from the river. We learned that nutrients are important because they're major components of amino acids necessary for primary producers or a source of energy for bacteria. We learned there are many elements in seawater that are trace nutrients found at low concentrations but immensely important to productivity. And you learned that migratory shorebirds rely on the productivity of estuaries to refuel during their annual migration. So that wraps up today, and I will see you all next week. You have several chapters that are assigned for reading next week, so you will have homework, and I'll be working today on getting those questions up, so you'll have them to start on this weekend if you so choose. Have a great weekend!